welcome back to our series, His Story. Believe it or not, we are in week 10. Hopefully you have read chapter 10, Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And I want to welcome our Sapulpa campus, our Coweta campus, our online viewers. I'm glad you've been along with us on this journey as we are getting to know Jesus like we've never known Him before. We've got to jump right into the text because we've got lots to talk about. We left off with Jesus in Bethany, which is a suburb of Jerusalem. It's in Bethany where Jesus' friends Lazarus and Mary and Martha all lived. It's where Lazarus had been raised from the dead just recently, and Jesus has been there. But we get into chapter 10. Jesus is going to leave Bethany, which is on the east side of Jerusalem. He is going to come through on the Mount of Olives, which overlooks Jerusalem, and he is going to come in what we call the triumphal entry on this incredible Sunday, walking into Jerusalem. Again, from high up in the mountains, it actually is going to be about 300 feet above Jerusalem, and he's going to descend down into the city gates of Jerusalem from the east. Now, we know from the story that Jesus has already sent a couple of his disciples into Jerusalem to secure a donkey colt so that he could ride. And however that happened, those arrangements have been made. And Jesus now is coming into the city that is going to be packed with people. In fact, not only are there people that are there from all over the place, but people have been arriving and are coming now with Jesus, maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands of pilgrims. Now, this is in preparation for Passover. We understand that Jerusalem has a population normally during this time frame of probably 50,000 to maybe 100,000 people. But Josephus estimates for us that during Passover, there might have been as many as 250,000 lambs that were sacrificed during this time frame. That's a whole bunch. And if you start trying to do some calculation per family, it could be that there were 1 million, some estimates as many as 2 million people who are gathered in Jerusalem for this Passover feast that's about to take place. So what you've got going on is Jesus, who is approaching to this place that is already packed with people, other people coming along with Jesus. And remember, Jesus has just recently raised Lazarus from the dead. And so there are crowds of people that are following him now. This may be the height of his popularity in this area of Jerusalem as he descends into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. He is walking down into this city gate. The anticipation, the build-up, the excitement is happening. And we begin to see some incredible things that start happening. And if you are one of Jesus' disciples, you might be thinking to yourself, finally, this is what we've been waiting for. This is what we've been looking forward to the whole time. Finally, the people are getting it. Finally, we're going to crown Jesus as the King of Israel, and everything is going to be good. In fact, when you start seeing what the people are doing as Jesus walks in and as people are following him, it's a pretty remarkable picture. Matthew 21 says, a large crowd spread their cloaks on the road. People are taking their garments off, their coats off, they're putting them on the road. Others are cutting branches from the palm trees and spreading them on the road. And the crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed are shouting out some words here. We need to talk about them for just a little bit, but let's pause and let's talk about things that are happening. What Jesus is doing at this point is he is riding in on a donkey colt. Now, that doesn't sound very kingly to us. But that would be in that particular era of time. In fact, a king who was coming in from battle, he might ride in on a stallion, but a king during a peaceful time would ride in on a donkey colt, and especially one that's never been ridden before. That's the case with Jesus. People are laying their garments down. People are waving palm branches. I mean, we understand that. That's even a sign of royalty in old movies that you've seen of people waving palm branches in front of somebody. And so already we have the actions of someone who is kingly. Now listen to what the people say. Hosanna! They're crying out, Hosanna. The word means save now, save us now, save us please, save us now. And so people are saying this to this person who is looking like a king, who is going through the actions of like a coronation. And people are acting as if they are going to place the king on his throne and crown upon his head. Hosanna, save us now. They also say, the Son of David. Now, that's a pretty significant thing right there, because they would have respected. I mean, he was the king of Israel. He was the warrior king of Israel. And to give that name to Jesus now, Hosanna to the Son of David, is like granting him the rights to the throne. And then he says this, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This is prophecy or words right out of Ezekiel chapter 43. And the picture there in Ezekiel is the Messiah coming in from the mountain down into the east gate of Jerusalem. I mean, this is exactly what Jesus is doing. This is fulfillment of prophecy that it would have been recognized. I mean, they could not have missed this, that this is the Messiah that is coming through the east gate. In fact, the text tells us that the entire city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. The place is going crazy. I mean, can you imagine if you're in Jerusalem and it's already crowded and it's already people everywhere and already the hustle and bustle, and you see this parade coming down? You would have been able to look up and see it, and thousands of people merging into Jerusalem, people that respected Jesus, flowing out of Jerusalem, meeting them there, and this incredible parade coming into Jerusalem, this celebration, people saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Let's stop for just a minute, because we've been talking about wanting to know Jesus. And we learned something about this triumphal entry, that those who know Jesus celebrate being with him. Those that know Jesus look forward to being with him, and they celebrate it. They get excited about it. And this crowd is pulsing. This crowd is enthusiastic. They are excited to be with Jesus. They are excited because they think that they are going to pronounce him as king, and that Jesus is going to let them be an earthly king. They are celebrating that, and Jesus lets them. And Jesus participates in this thing, riding in, looking as a king into this triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And we have to just stop and recognize that there is something positive, something exciting. And we see it when people recognize Jesus in their life, when they see what Jesus has done. Many of these people have experienced miracles that Jesus has performed on them. And they are just simply celebrating the fact that they are right there, right then, with Jesus. People who know Jesus celebrate being with him. But people who don't know him, they don't celebrate, they complain. People that don't know Jesus, they just complain about stuff. In fact, it's mostly what we're going to see, religious people. In fact, you can almost differentiate here with Jesus in lots of different situations that he interacts with people, encounters that he has with people. The people that don't have anything to offer, they're the ones that celebrate being with Jesus. But the church people, the religious people, they're the ones that don't know Jesus, and they're always complaining about him. On the way into town, the Pharisees are saying to Jesus, Jesus, rebuke your followers for saying things like that. Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They knew exactly what the people were saying, and they're saying, rebuke your followers for saying those things. And Jesus said, hey, listen, if I make them be quiet, then even the rocks are going to cry out in praise to me. Just saying, there's nothing I can do to stop this. This is a natural progression. And if the people stop doing it, then nature itself is going to stop this. We're told that as they go down into the city and approach the temple area, that it is the teachers of the law and the priests down there in front of the temple who begin to complain and say, do you hear what these children are saying? Do you hear what's going on out here? Again, expecting Jesus to do something about it. You hear what's taking place? This is blasphemy. And Jesus says, well, are you illiterate? Can't you read? From the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise. Jesus quotes right out of Psalms Psalms chapter 8. In fact, you know the psalm because we have sang it in an old chorus that goes like, "Oh Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." And it starts with that and it ends with it. And in the middle of it is this idea of children and infants praising Jesus. And Jesus is saying, don't you know the scriptures? This is going to happen. And it's as if Jesus walks into the temple and he sees all of this, and it's almost as if it's too late in the day for him to do what he needs to do. And he turns around and he walks and he goes back to Bethany and he spends the night. Well, Jesus is going to be there the rest of the week. I mean, we have entered Jerusalem and things are set into place for what's going to end up being his death and his resurrection. And all of that's going to take place at this time frame. We are in the final week of Jesus' life right here. Tuesday morning or Monday morning, that was Sunday. Monday morning, on the way back from Bethany into Jerusalem, Jesus gets hungry. He sees a fig tree off in the distance, and evidently he is planning to eat something from that. Now, what we find out pretty quickly is that there's no fruit on this tree. But as you read the words, you recognize that really Jesus wasn't expecting there to be fruit, or at least there to be ripe fruit, because it was too early in the season. And Jesus is actually going to curse this fig tree, and he's going to say, "May no one ever eat from you again." And you look at that and you go, why would Jesus do that if there wasn't supposed to be ripe fruit on it anyway? Well, the issue was this: it had leaves on it. And if there are leaves on a fig tree, there is fruit on a fig tree, or at least there's supposed to be. Now, it may not be edible at this point, but it could go to go against your hunger. And so Jesus recognizes that there's not ever going to be fruit on this tree because it's not there now. It should have it on there, but it doesn't have it on there now. And so Jesus is basically going to say, you have not done what you were created to do. You're not producing as you were created to produce. May no one ever eat from you again. In fact, what we're going to read is the next day when Jesus and his disciples come by, that this tree has withered up and died. Jesus has cursed this. It's the only time we see that Jesus ever cursed anything. And that's going to be the case right here. But what's interesting is what happens in between. Because this instance of the fig tree and what Jesus says to it, and the next day when they come and they find that the fig tree has died, something significant takes place in there, and they are all related together. Because what's going to take place later on Monday is that Jesus is going to walk into the temple and he is going to do something that he has already done before. We call it the cleansing of the temple. Now remember, Jesus did this early on in his ministry. So it's been like 3 years ago. Jesus walked into the temple and he started turning tables over and he chased people out. And he said, "You've turned my Father's house into a marketplace." In fact, what Jesus was doing is saying, you are ripping people off. And we talked about how they were refusing people's sacrifices and saying it wasn't kosher, it wasn't good enough. And they were charging them extra for a lamb. And then they were charging them a price to be able to change their money. And so it was a racket, and the high priest was getting rich off the thing. And Jesus was saying something very specific. Jesus is going to do this again. I believe it's a very different event. The first one took place early on in Jesus' ministry. This one is going to take place at the very end of Jesus' ministry. And Jesus is going to be concentrating on something very different. In fact, look at what he says in Mark chapter 11. And he taught them this, as he's doing this, as he's sending the people out and overturning tables. Is it not written, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers"? Now, what's interesting is that Jesus right here is quoting from two different Old Testament scriptures. He's quoting right here from Isaiah, and then this last one he's quoting from Jeremiah. And what's interesting is Jesus has a whole different perspective on things. In fact, this first one is, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." Now, Jesus isn't emphasizing prayer right there. What Jesus is emphasizing is that the temple was intended to be a place where people could come and pray to God, people from all nations. But what the Jewish people had done is, while God intended that, they had made it an exclusive place where no one but them could come. In fact, the temple equaled access to God. In the Old Testament days, in that era for Jerusalem and the temple, that was the place where you went to meet with God. God wasn't limited to the temple, but that was the place that he had made known that people could come see him. And the Jewish leaders had said, we're going to make this an exclusive place just for us. And so Jesus is lambasting their exclusivity, saying that's not what this was intended to be. It was intended to be a place for all nations. Now, he's also dealing with her hypocrisy right here. He said, you've made it into a den of robbers. In fact, what's interesting is if you go back and read that Jeremiah 7 passage where Jesus is quoting from, that whole passage talks about how people are doing detestable things, but they show up in the temple and do their sacrifices, and they say, we're safe. Remember when you were a kid and you played tag or you played some game outside with all the neighborhood kids, and there was always a home base, and it was there that you were safe. You touched it and you went, I'm safe, home base. And that's exactly what is being described in Jeremiah chapter 7 and what Jesus is referring to. He's saying, you people are acting like whatever you want to, but you show up in the temple and you go through the routines and you're saying, we're safe. God can't get us here because we're on base. We're doing what we're supposed to. And Jesus is saying, you are missing the entire point because my temple, God's place, God's house was to be a place where all people could access him. So let me talk about what we learned from this. That those who know Jesus, they help others access him. See, that's what God has wanted from his people all along, that they would be a people that would bless others, that they would be a people that would help others access God. That's what he wanted from his people, from his children. He wanted them to bless all the nations, and yet they were so exclusive. And what Jesus is saying is, let me make sure you understand what the temple is all about. It is about all people coming to God. And what Jesus is setting up for is ultimately there's going to be a destruction of this physical temple. Jesus is going to talk about it in just a few minutes. And God is no longer going to work through a physical place. In fact, what God is about to do is he is about to release thousands and thousands and thousands of physical body temples. In fact, the New Testament is going to tell us that God resides in our heart, that we become temples. The Holy Spirit lives within us. And no longer is the temple limited to a geographical place. It becomes only limited to God's people who are going to spread throughout the world. And so Jesus is going to say, I want people to access the Father God through me. And in essence, he is cursing the Jewish system because it was preventing access to God. Religion was getting in the way of people coming to God. And Jesus says it doesn't work that way. In fact, that's what he calls us all to do. He calls us never to be a barrier to people who are trying to come to Jesus. In fact, it was just a couple of chapters ago that says, if you hinder one of these little children come to me, it's going to be far worse for you. And so Jesus is saying we cannot be a hindrance. As a church, we cannot be a barrier. If there's anything that we are doing that is preventing people's access to God, then we're the ones in the wrong. We're the ones that have to correct it. That was the problem with the Jewish system. And Jesus is saying people that know me, they know I'm all about bringing people to God. Now, it gets played out a little bit because as they're talking, we find out that there's many people that are believing in Jesus. Jesus is still doing miracles. Jesus is there in Jerusalem, and good things are happening. People are believing in him. However, even some of the Jewish leaders are believing him. But they wouldn't admit it for fear that the Pharisees would expel them from the synagogue. Now, we don't get that a whole lot, kicked out of the synagogue, kicked out of the church. It just doesn't mean it means you just can't show up on Sunday. Well, no. That's not what it meant. It certainly meant that they would not be allowed to go in and worship on the Sabbath. But this was their whole way of doing life. This was life for them. This was their relationships. This was their whole system. These are the people that they bartered and traded and did business with. If they were expelled from the synagogue, it was a bad thing for them. And there were some Jewish leaders who actually believed in Jesus, but because they were afraid that they might lose what they had, they would not admit it. Listen to this. For they loved human praise more than the praise of God. Wow. What an incredible statement. That people would recognize that Jesus is who he says he is, but would be afraid to tell anybody about it because they were more afraid of what people would think and what people would say than what God would think. It's hard for us to imagine somebody in that kind of situation. Or maybe it's not. What are the things that you have not said about Jesus? What are the things that you have not done? How is it you maybe have not lived? Things that you would have done, or things that you wanted to do, or things you wished you had done, but you didn't want to be a fanatic. You didn't want to appear too religious. Didn't want to seem like some other people, and you just did nothing, and people didn't know that you were a believer, that you were a follower. They were more afraid of what people thought than what God thought. Well, we're told that as Jesus and his disciples were leaving, that some of the disciples were commenting on just the incredible architecture of the temple, and it was certainly an incredible place. You can go and read about all that it was during Jesus' day. But as Jesus walks out, he makes a comment to him, something like this, that there will be no stone left unturned. There will be no stone left on top of another. And he walks on, and he's walking on to the Mount of Olives, and it's like the disciples are like, what? And they're thinking, wait a minute, Jesus, we just walked in here a day ago, and we were expecting that you are going to be the one now who is going to be the king of Jerusalem, the king of Israel. This is our temple. This is going to be the place where you are going to reign from. And now you're saying there's not even going to be a temple, and maybe they're running up, catching, Jesus, wait a minute. And it's like Jesus goes all the way up to the Mount of Olives before they even catch him. And it's there that they begin to have this conversation. In fact, the disciples begin to ask some questions like, hey, Jesus, wait a minute. That thing you were talking about, when's that going to happen? What are you talking about? And Jesus is going to go into a discourse where he is actually going to talk about something that is physically going to happen in 70 A.D. In fact, from about 66 to about 70 A.D., the Roman government is going to siege Jerusalem, and Jerusalem eventually is going to be completely demolished, and the temple, just as Jesus predicts, is going to be destroyed. Now, as Jesus begins to talk about that, you begin to read, and some of those things really make sense. But then, obviously, Jesus begins at some point to transition, and he begins to talk about things that are going to happen at the end of time. He is talking about ultimately when he is going to return. Now, quite honestly, I don't know all the time if Jesus is talking about the events that are going to take place when Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 A.D. and when he switches off and he's talking about the end of time. In fact, it's almost as if Jesus seems to intermingle them, and they're on top of one another, and sometimes they mean both. We don't know, I don't know quite honestly what all of those things. In fact, it could be that the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. is basically a microcosm of what's going to happen when Jesus is going to return, and Jesus intends for it to be all muddied up. But what Jesus is very clear about is that people that know him are going to be prepared. They're going to be prepared for his return. In fact, Jesus is going to share 4 stories, 4 parables, and every one of them has the same message. The message is simply going to be this: be ready. Jesus is going to tell about a homeowner who says if he would have known that the burglar was going to come in the middle of the night, he would have been prepared. He would have gotten ready. And Jesus is just making an analogy right there that I will come like a thief in the night. I will return like a thief in the night. Now, you can't take the analogy on to Jesus is going to do destruction. And that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is simply saying, I will come without warning. You be ready because I will come and it will be completely unexpected. That's the end of the analogy. That's what Jesus is trying to say with that story. Then Jesus tells another story about a steward who is given a kind of a run of the master's place, and the master is going to be gone, and the steward thinks, well, you know, the master's going to be gone for a long time. He won't be back for a while, and we're told that he begins to party, he begins to drink, he begins to beat the servants, and the steward comes back, or the master comes back, and it's bad news for the steward. And again, Jesus is saying, be ready, because it may be later than what you expect. It may seem like I'm not ever coming. In fact, that may be true for us, for our world. But Jesus has been talking about coming back. We've been preaching it from churches, and people are going, whatever, it's been 2,000 years. And Jesus is saying, be ready. It may be later than what you expected. It may have been a while, but I'm coming back. Jesus is then going to tell a parable about 10 bridesmaids. These bridesmaids are waiting for the groom to come. He has gone to get the bride. He has gone to come back. And you never knew in this era. This was something that took days and days and days to take place. And these bridesmaids are waiting there. But 5 of them didn't bring enough oil. And when it's announced that they're going to come and they don't have the oil that they need and they beg for some more, but they have to run and go get some at the store and they're not ready and they miss the party. They miss the reception. They miss the parade coming in. And the story again is teaching us, be ready. It may be sooner than expected. The other story said it may be later than expected. This one, it may be sooner than you expect, but be ready. Anticipate Jesus' return. Then Jesus is going to tell a 4th story. It's about talents. It's about a king who gave some of his servants talents. To one he gave 5 bags of silver. To one he gave 2 bags of silver. To one he gave 1 bag of silver. And he says, I want you to invest it. And the one with 5 earned 5 more. The one with 2 gained 2 more. But the one with 1 buried it. Now we tend to think of that as, he didn't want to lose it. But really what his intentions were is he hoped that the master would never come back and never claim his money, and that would be his. He would have it all to himself. It would have been all forgotten. And what Jesus is saying is, you be ready. In fact, you servants have been entrusted with the gospel. And you need to share it. You need to invest it. You need to be ready because I am returning. So Jesus reminds those of us that know him that those who know Jesus, they anticipate his return. They are prepared for his return. It may be sooner than expected. It may be later than expected. The message is not when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, how it's going to happen. Jesus says we won't know those things. But you be ready when it does happen, because it will happen. And when I come, you be faithful to me. What's interesting is that the very last story that Jesus tells in this 10th chapter of his story kind of puts them all together. Those that know Jesus, they celebrate him. Those that know Jesus, they help others access him. Those that know Jesus, they anticipate his return. And this last story is about all of that. And it's also about how you and I get to know Jesus better. In fact, that's what we've talked about wanting to do, is through this, not just getting to know more stuff about Jesus, but getting to know Jesus better. The last story is found in Matthew 25, and it's a picture of judgment. In fact, it talks about the Son of Man gathering all the nations in front of him, and he's going to separate the people like a shepherd would separate the sheep from the goats. And he looks to all the people on his right, and he says to them, I'm going to put you there because when I was hungry, you fed me. And when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And when I was a stranger, you gave me a place to stay. And when I was naked, you put clothes on me. And when I was sick, you took care of me. And when I was in prison, you came and visited me. And the people are on the right going, Jesus, we didn't know that. We didn't know that. We didn't even see you. And he goes, no. When you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. In fact, this is how it's worded, Matthew 25:40. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. You didn't recognize me. You didn't know it was me. But when you did it for someone who was down and out, for someone that was not privileged, when you did it for one of those, you did it for me. Now Jesus is going to turn to the left and he's going to say, now for you. What's interesting here is that it's almost as if these people were expected to recognize Jesus as well. Quite honestly, I'm not sure that this is anything more than a judgment of the people that would call themselves the church. Because he talks about brothers and sisters and people that ought to recognize Jesus, and I don't think Jesus would expect that from unbelievers. I'm not so sure this isn't a picture of Jesus gathering his church together and making judgment on them, and on those on the left. He's saying, when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. And when I was thirsty, you didn't give me drink. And when I was in prison, you didn't visit me. And when I was sick, you didn't help me. And when I was naked, you didn't clothe me. And they said, Jesus, Jesus, we didn't know it was you. How we didn't know it was you? And Jesus is saying, that's right. You didn't, but you didn't do it for the least of these. What Jesus is saying is that our faith has to be put into practice. That our faith has to have some level of compassion where we care for other people. In fact, Jesus has been saying that all along. He cares more about compassion than sacrifice. He cares about more about you caring for people than you doing religious ritual. And here again, he's saying, whatever you did for these that really needed it, you did it for me. But Jesus, we had faith. Well, you didn't put the faith into practice. In fact, we could make a pretty good case that faith without works really isn't faith at all. That's what James, the brother of Jesus, would say. Faith without works is dead. If for no other reason, Christian, you need to be compassionate and you need to care for the people that need food and people that need drink and people that need help because they're sick and people that are down and out and do without. You need to care for those people if for no other reason because you want to touch Jesus. For no other reason you need to do something compassionate because you want to touch Jesus. You want to know Jesus. That's what this is all about, is recognizing Jesus in people like that. Don't do it because it's effective, because quite honestly, you and I, we have both done things that are done in the name of compassion. We have fed people that told us they were homeless and they've ripped us off and they bought alcohol. And let me tell you, don't do it because it is effective, because sometimes it is not. We do it because we want to get to know Jesus better. We want to meet Jesus. That's what Jesus is saying in Matthew 25, is that people know me, they do this. They put their faith into practice and they get to know me better. You know what? I have found Jesus in a homeless person in Johannesburg, South Africa. I have met Jesus at the Laura Dester shelter in the eyes of a little child that I'm reading a book to, and that was the only comfort that they had that day. I've met Jesus in Juarez, Mexico, in the eyes of a grateful mom who teared up and hugged me because I helped her to build a house. And that's what Jesus expects of people that know Him. Listen, you can't do everything, but you can do something. You cannot read Matthew 25. You cannot read this story and do nothing, or you will hear Jesus say, "Depart from me into eternal punishment." Father, thank you for helping us to get to know your Son Jesus better. God, I'm praying that we will be people like what took place in that triumphal entry, that we will celebrate the coming of Jesus into our lives, and that people would recognize it. God, help us to not be negative complainers. Help us to not be what people think of church as always against stuff. Help us to be a people that celebrate. And God, help us to be a people that give access to you. God, help our church not to be in any way a barrier, a hindrance to people. Help us in our preferences, in our desires, not to keep people from you. And God, help us to look forward to when your Son Jesus is going to return. And in the meantime, God, may we love people like we would love Jesus. We pray it in Jesus' name.